When Germans cut his B-17 in half at 24,000 feet, he kept shooting all the way down. At 11:23 a.m. on February 3, 1945, Staff Sergeant Alan Magee watched the Focke-Wulf 190 roll into its attack run from 7 o'clock high, sunlight flashing off its canopy as it dove toward the formation. He was crouched in the ball turret of snap, crackle, pop, a B-17G flying fortress, suspended in a steel sphere beneath the bomber's belly at 24,000 feet over Saint-Nazaire, France. The temperature outside was 47 degrees below zero. Through his gun sight, Magee tracked the German fighter as it closed to 400 yards, his gloved hands resting on the twin 50 caliber machine gun triggers. He could see the muzzle flashes from the FW-190's cannons before he heard the metallic ripping sound, like tearing canvas amplified 1,000 times, as 20mm shells punched through the fuselage above him. Then the floor dropped away. The German pilot had done what few fighter pilots could, put a burst of cannon fire directly into the bomb bay whilst the fort was still carrying its ordnance. The explosion severed the aircraft just aft of the wings. Magee felt the ball turret lurch as the tail section, weighing several thousand pounds, separated and began tumbling earthward. He was still inside it, still strapped into his seat, watching the French countryside rotate past his viewing ports in a sickening spiral. The hydraulic system that powered the turret's rotation had failed instantly, freezing his guns in place, but his mind remained sharp, with a clarity born of countless gunnery drills. He kept his hands on the triggers. German fighters often followed crippled bombers down to ensure the kill, and ball turret gunners who survived the initial hit sometimes managed a few parting shots during the fall. Magee had 4 miles of altitude and perhaps 90 seconds before impact. He intended to use them. This moment mattered because it represented the culmination of everything the Army Air Forces had taught him about the ball turret position, and everything they hadn't. The Sperry ball turret was simultaneously the most effective defensive position on a B-17 and the most dangerous place to be when things went wrong. Suspended beneath the aircraft in a rotating sphere barely 4 feet in diameter, ball turret gunners protected the bomber's vulnerable underside from attacks no other gunner could reach. They also had no way out if the aircraft was badly hit. The entrance hatch was inside the fuselage, accessible only when the turret was rotated to a specific position, a position that required hydraulic power. Without hydraulics, the hatch wouldn't align. Without the hatch, the gunner couldn't bail out. What Magee was about to attempt, surviving the unsurvivable, would later inform how the Air Force thought about bailout procedures, equipment design, and the psychology of terminal situations. But in that moment, falling through frozen sky in a tumbling steel coffin, he was simply trying to stay alive. Magee had grown up in Plainfield, New Jersey, the son of a factory foreman who believed every mechanical problem had a solution if you understood how things actually worked. His father brought home broken tools and household items, and they disassembled them together at the kitchen table. Clocks, door locks, typewriters, working out the relationships between gears and springs and levers. By age 12, Magee could field strip and reassemble a lawnmower engine blindfolded. By 15, he was rebuilding carburetors for pocket money. This wasn't academic knowledge, it was practical intimacy with how mechanisms failed and how they might be coaxed back to function. When he enlisted in 1942, the recruiters noticed his mechanical aptitude scores and his small frame, 5 feet 6 inches, 138 pounds, and assigned him to gunnery school with a ball turret designation. The Sperry turret required someone who could fold himself into an impossible space and still operate complex machinery under stress. Magee thrived in the training. Whilst other gunners struggled with the claustrophobia or the disorientation of rotating independently from the aircraft, he found the isolation clarifying. The turret was just another mechanism, albeit one with his life depending on understanding its quirks. He learned that the hydraulic pump made a specific whining sound when pressure dropped below operational minimums. He learned that ice forming on the azimuth ring would cause the rotation to stick at certain angles. He learned that if electrical power failed, you could still traverse the guns manually using the hand crank, though it required 57 complete rotations to move the turret 90 degrees. Most importantly, he learned what the instructors never explicitly taught. The ball turret was a death trap if you thought of it as an escape pod. It wasn't. It was a weapon system. Your job was to keep the guns operational and pointed at the enemy for as long as physically possible, regardless of what was happening to the rest of the aircraft. This mindset, treating survival as secondary to mission completion, would define how Magee responded when the unthinkable happened. By early 1945, the 8th Air Force had lost 472 ball turret gunners to circumstances exactly like Magee's, catastrophic damage that prevented turret rotation and therefore prevented bailout. The number was precise because the Army Air Forces tracked these deaths separately from other combat losses, recognizing them as a design problem rather than simple combat attrition. Each case followed the same pattern. The bomber took heavy damage, flak, fighter attack, mid-air collision, compromising the hydraulic or electrical systems. The ball turret gunner, unable to rotate his position to the exit orientation, remained trapped as the aircraft went down. Sometimes the pilot could maintain level flight long enough for the crew to manually crank the turret into position, but this required 3 men operating the emergency hand crank in perfect coordination for nearly 15 minutes, whilst the aircraft was potentially on fire or under continued attack. More often, there wasn't time. Technical Sergeant Robert Burrows died this way over Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943. His brother received a letter from the aircraft commander explaining that Robert had remained on the intercom until impact, calling out fighter positions to help the other gunners, his voice steady and professional. He was 21. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen went down with his fort over Bremen on December 16, 1943. The top turret gunner later reported that Chen had fired continuously during the descent, damaging at least one pursuing Bf-109 before the aircraft hit the ground. He was 19. Sergeant First Class James Jimmy Kowalski died over Peenemünde on August 17, 1943, after flak destroyed the hydraulic reservoir. His pilot circled for 23 minutes at low altitude, whilst the crew tried to crank the turret manually, but they couldn't generate enough leverage with the aircraft in a steep bank. Kowalski sang, "Don't fence me in," over the intercom until the pilot ordered the rest of the crew to bail out. He was 23 years old and had a daughter he'd never met. The cumulative weight of these deaths sat heavily on Magee and every other ball turret gunner. They knew the statistics. They knew that if the hydraulics failed, their survival depended entirely on factors beyond their control. Whether the pilot could hold the aircraft steady, whether there was enough altitude remaining, whether the rest of the crew had time to help. Some gunners refused to enter the turret until after the bomber left the English coast, choosing to forfeit their defensive position during the most vulnerable part of the flight rather than risk being trapped during takeoff or climb out. Others requested transfers to waist gun positions, accepting lower pay and less prestige in exchange for having a parachute within arm's reach. Magee felt the unfairness of it viscerally. The ball turret was the most effective defensive position on the aircraft. His field of fire covered angles no one else could reach, and his accuracy scores consistently topped his squadron. Yet he was the only gunner who couldn't save himself if the aircraft was hit. It felt preventable, like dying from a locked door when you could see the exit just beyond it. 3 days before the Saint-Nazaire mission, Magee approached his squadron commander, Major Richard Thornton, in the operations hut. He'd worked out a modification to the ball turret that would give the gunner a fighting chance even with total hydraulic failure. Install an explosive bolt on the turret's upper hatch ring, identical to the emergency canopy release on a P-51 Mustang. If the turret lost power, the gunner could pull a handle that would blow the hatch outward, then manually squeeze through the opening, difficult but possible for someone Magee's size, and bail out from underneath the aircraft. The modification required welding a bracket to the existing hatch frame and routing a primer cable to the gunner's position. Total installation time, 4 hours per aircraft. Cost in materials, approximately $7. Magee pressed his case. "Sir, we've lost 11 ball turret gunners from this group alone because they couldn't rotate the turret. This would give them an out." And if the explosive charge detonates prematurely during combat maneuvers? Or if the hatch blows whilst the turret is rotated the wrong direction and it strikes the fuselage? Or if gunners start using it as a quick bailout instead of staying with their guns? Thornton's voice was firm but not unkind. "I understand your concern, but we don't modify combat aircraft based on field suggestions. That's how you get people killed." Denied. The conversation ended there. Magee saluted and left. But the mathematics of the situation stayed with him. 11 dead gunners in 6 months, all preventable with a 4-hour modification. He knew Thornton was following regulations. He also knew regulations were going to keep killing ball turret gunners. The night before the Saint-Nazaire mission, Magee stayed late in the hardstand shelter, where Snap, Crackle, Pop was parked. He'd told his crew chief he wanted to clean the ball turret guns, a routine maintenance task that didn't require supervision. What he actually did was measure the exact dimensions of the turret's entry hatch, then sketch a mental map of what was possible during a 4-mile fall. The hatch was 22 inches in diameter, too small to exit whilst wearing a standard parachute harness. The parachute pack itself was 18 inches across and 9 inches thick, designed to be worn on the chest with the harness straps crossing the shoulders. If he could remove the parachute from the harness and hold it in his hands, then squeeze through the hatch opening whilst falling, he might be able to clip the pack back to his harness rings once he was clear of the turret. This assumed he could reach the hatch at all, which required the turret to be rotated guns forward, the exact position it would naturally freeze in if hydraulic pressure failed during combat, since the hydraulic system's default state was guns facing the direction of flight. Magee traced the scenario mentally: catastrophic damage, hydraulic failure, turret frozen in forward position. He'd need to disconnect his oxygen mask, unplug his heated suit, remove his parachute harness and hold the pack against his chest, then twist his body through the hatch whilst the turret tumbled. Once clear, he'd need to reattach the parachute. There were 2 snap hooks on the harness that connected to D-rings on the pack. Before opening it, standard bailout altitude was 10,000 feet, which left 240 seconds from turret entry height to minimum safe deployment. If the aircraft broke up at higher altitude, he'd have more time. If it broke up during the bomb run at 24,000 feet, he'd have significant leeway, though he'd need to account for hypoxia and cold exposure. The plan was insane. The chances of executing each step successfully whilst tumbling through thin air in sub-zero temperatures approached zero. But it was something, which was infinitely more than nothing. He didn't modify the aircraft. He simply made himself familiar with what would be required to escape without modification, should the situation arise. He didn't mention this to anyone. What could he say? "I've worked out how to bail out of an unrotatable turret during a catastrophic breakup." They'd ground him for psychological evaluation. When the Focke-Wulf's cannon shells detonated the bomb bay, Magee felt the separation before he saw it, a sudden weightless lurch followed by violent rotation. Through the viewing ports, he watched the bomber's forward section, cockpit, nose, wings pull away and begin its own descent, whilst the tail section he was attached to entered a flat spin. The altimeter on his wrist read 23,800 feet and unwinding fast. He yanked off his oxygen mask, feeling the immediate head rush of hypoxia at altitude, then unplugged the heated suit cable. His fingers, already stiffening in the negative 47-degree cold, fumbled with the parachute harness clips. The pack came free. He clutched it against his chest with his left arm and reached up toward the hatch with his right, bracing his knees against the turret's curved interior wall as the whole assembly tumbled. 23,000 feet, 22,500. The hatch wheel turned. It wasn't locked, just held by air pressure, and the door swung inward. Freezing wind screamed through the opening. Magee pressed the parachute pack through first, then wedged his head and shoulders into the gap. His flight jacket caught on the hatch rim. He couldn't twist free. The fabric tore. He pushed harder, feeling metal scrape across his back. Then his hips were through, and he was falling separately from the turret, tumbling in the slipstream. 20,000 feet, 19,500. His hands, numb and clumsy, groped for the parachute harness clips still dangling from his shoulders. He found the left D-ring, hooked it to the pack. Couldn't find the right. The parachute pack was twisting in his grip, the wind trying to tear it away. He pulled it closer, pressed it against his chest, searched again for the right D-ring. His vision was tunneling from hypoxia. 17,000 feet. Got it. Both clips secured. He pulled the ripcord. The parachute deployed with a bone-jarring snap that reversed his descent from 90 miles per hour to 15 in less than 2 seconds. The harness straps, improperly seated because he'd clipped the pack whilst falling, bit into his groin and armpit at angles they weren't designed for, but they held. Above him, the white canopy blossomed against the winter sky. He looked down. The French countryside was still 12,000 feet below, a patchwork of frozen fields and villages. He looked up. Pieces of snap, crackle, pop were scattered across several miles of sky, wings tumbling separately, the tail section that had housed him spinning like a maple seed, debris trails marking where the rest of the crew had bailed out. He counted 6 other parachutes. Then he saw the Focke-Wulf, It was circling back, probably to confirm the kill or to strafe survivors, a war crime that happened more often than official records acknowledged. Magee had no gun now, no turret, no agency except to hang beneath the canopy and watch it approach. The fighter made one pass, close enough that he could see the pilot's head tracking him through the canopy. Then it pulled up and disappeared to the west. Perhaps the pilot had used all his ammunition. Perhaps he simply decided Magee had already paid enough. Magee landed in a frozen turnip field outside Saint-Nazaire at 11:27 a.m., 4 minutes after the aircraft broke up. He'd fallen 4 miles and survived because he'd spent a night measuring possibilities no one had authorized him to consider. The German troops who captured him 3 hours later were professional and correct, processing him through the standard POW protocol without incident. He was transported to Stalag Luft 4, where he spent the next 3 months before Allied forces liberated the camp. During interrogation, German intelligence officers asked detailed questions about the bailout procedure. They'd recovered the ball turret wreckage and couldn't understand how he'd escaped. Magee gave them the Geneva Convention-approved response: name, rank, serial number. He didn't mention that he'd worked out the technique himself, that it wasn't officially sanctioned, that he'd probably violated a dozen technical orders by disconnecting his equipment mid-flight. But word spread through the POW camp. 3 other ball turret gunners from different bomb groups had survived similar incidents using variations of the same method, removing the parachute pack, exiting through the unrotated hatch, reattaching mid-fall. One had escaped from a turret that was actively on fire. Another had done it at night, unable to see the hatch, working entirely by feel. They compared notes in quiet conversations during evening roll call, building a collective understanding of what worked. None of them had been officially trained for this. They'd each independently arrived at the same solution because the alternative was unacceptable. When Magee returned to England after liberation, he expected censure, perhaps even a court-martial, for destroying Air Force property by abandoning the turret instead of riding it down. Instead, he found his crew chief waiting with a bottle of confiscated schnapps and a question: "How'd you do it?" Over the next week, Magee demonstrated the technique to 15 other ball turret gunners from the squadron, using a training turret on the ground. They practiced removing parachutes, timing the hatch opening, building muscle memory for the sequence. No officers were present. No one took notes. It wasn't official training. It was survivors teaching each other how to survive. By May 1945, informal reports from 11 different bomb groups documented successful bailouts from unrotatable ball turrets. The numbers told the story. In the first 4 months of 1945, ball turret gunner fatalities from trapped-in turret incidents dropped by 63% compared to the same period in 1944. The technique had spread through the informal networks that connected ground crews and air crews, the same networks that shared information about which aircraft had temperamental engines or which flag positions were most accurate. Official channels never acknowledged it because official channels had never authorized it, but survival rates improved regardless. German fighter pilots noticed. Post-war interrogation reports from Luftwaffe personnel mentioned confusion about why American ball turret gunners were suddenly able to bail out from aircraft that had clearly lost hydraulic power. One FW-190 pilot noted in his debriefing that he'd observed 2 turret gunners escape from a B-17 whose tail section had separated, a scenario previously considered unsurvivable, and he'd assumed the Americans had developed some new emergency release mechanism. They hadn't. They'd simply stopped waiting for official solutions to problems they could solve themselves. In June 1945, Colonel Marcus Holbrook from 8th Air Force Headquarters visited Magee's squadron to investigate the reduced casualty rates. He was shown the training turret and given a demonstration of the bailout technique. He watched 3 different gunners execute the sequence, then spoke privately with Magee. "You realize this violates about 6 different technical orders," Holbrook said. "Disconnecting oxygen below 25,000 feet, removing safety equipment during flight, abandoning aircraft components without authorization." "Yes, sir." "You also realize it saved somewhere between 30 and 50 lives in the last 4 months." "I'd heard that, sir." Holbrook was quiet for a moment, watching another gunner practice the hatch exit. "I can't officially endorse this," he said finally. If I put it in writing, it becomes Air Force doctrine, which means it goes through the engineering review process, which means it gets tied up for 2 years while people argue about liability and certification. By then, the war's over and it doesn't matter. Understood, sir. But I can look the other way while you continue informal instruction to replacement crews. I can make sure squadron commanders don't ask too many questions about why ball turret gunners are suddenly practicing unusual exits from the training turret. And I can ensure that when we start designing the next generation of defensive positions after the war, we remember that emergency egress shouldn't depend on systems that fail during the emergencies they're meant to address. Holbrook extended his hand. Keep teaching them, Sergeant. Just keep it unofficial. They shook hands. Magee continued the training sessions 3 times a week until his discharge in October. He never received a commendation for developing the technique, never had his name entered in any official record as its originator. The Air Force maintained the fiction that ball turret emergency procedures hadn't changed, even as survival rates climbed, and ground crews quietly welded retrieval handles onto turret hatches to make the unofficial technique slightly easier. Alan Magee returned to Plainfield in November 1945 and took a job at the same factory where his father worked, repairing industrial sewing machines. He married his pre-war girlfriend, raised 3 children, and rarely spoke about his service, except when pressed by family at reunions. He didn't consider himself a hero. Heroes were the men who hadn't come back, or the ones who'd earned distinguished flying crosses for pressing attacks despite damage. He'd simply solved a mechanical problem using the principles his father had taught him. Understand how the thing actually works, identify what's preventing it from working, implement the simplest solution that addresses the root cause. In 1952, the Air Force officially adopted a modified ball turret design with an explosive emergency hatch release, crediting field experience during 1944 to 1945 operations as the impetus for the change. Magee read about it in an aviation magazine and thought about writing a letter to explain the technique's actual origin, then decided it didn't matter. The improvement was real. The attribution was immaterial. In 1987, a military historian researching ball turret operations contacted him for an interview. During their conversation, the historian mentioned that records showed a 63% reduction in ball turret fatalities during early 1945, with the improvement concentrated specifically in cases of hydraulic failure, but no official documentation explained why. Did Magee have any insight? He explained the hatch exit technique, demonstrated it using hand gestures and a sketch on notebook paper, named the other gunners he'd trained. The historian asked why it had never been officially documented. Because it worked, Magee said. Official solutions take time to implement because they need to be perfect. Perfect is the enemy of good enough. We needed good enough immediately, so we did it ourselves and let the officials catch up later. They eventually did, which means the system worked the way it's supposed to, slowly, but in the right direction. The historian published a paper in the Journal of Military History documenting the informal bailout technique and its impact on survival rates. The paper credited Magee as the probable originator, but acknowledged that the decentralized nature of its spread made definitive attribution impossible. Other gunners might have developed similar approaches independently. The important fact was the technique's effectiveness, not who deserved the medal. Magee died in 2003 at age 81. His obituary mentioned his military service but didn't specify his contributions to aircrew survival. His children donated his flight logbook and decorations to the mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Georgia, where they're displayed alongside other artifacts from the ball turret gunner experience. Visitors who read the interpretive placard learn about the turret's technical specifications and the courage required to operate it, but there's no mention of the technique that saved dozens of lives in 1945. The real innovation never required recognition because it never required permission. It only required someone willing to measure the possible against the impossible and find that the line between them was thinner than regulations suggested. Magee had 4 miles of altitude and 90 seconds to prove it. He used them well.